One of the at least two big issues I wanted to raise for all of you in terms of questions, one of which I alluded to in my opening remarks, and that relates to the Olympics, which is something we have to and I think should talk about as it relates to these issues that we're addressing. And you can't, I don't think, have a conversation about the Olympics right now without talking about the allegations as it relates to Russian doping. So the first question I want to pose, really for all of you, but maybe I'll start with you, Gareth, and then David, you can comment as well, is with respect to the allegations of Russian doping, especially as it relates to the fact that the Russians by and large are participating now in the Rio Games, is there a structural problem as it relates to how doping allegations are addressed and dealt with, either as it relates to at the federation level or at the Olympic level?
I can attempt to answer that, but it's quite frustrating because as the first speaker, I'm just itching to respond to multiple points that were raised by others, not related to the IOC.
And we'll let you talk about the FIFA one. I know you're itching to talk about that one.
And if we do talk about that, can I ask first, to what are we recording this entire thing? Are we on the record for the whole thing?
I see a gentleman with a camera.
Okay,
and
so
headphones.
then I'll temper
yes.
my remarks about Qatar, or the ICSS, and a few others. Suffice to say on the ICSS, I'm really happy to hear that being brought up, because that is a particularly insidious form of manipulation of the discourse around anti-corruption in sport. We get approached all the time, and we have kept our politely refrained from participating, but what we see there is a huge widening of the net by attracting people under that umbrella.
That's right.
And I think that's precarious, because it should also be mentioned that the Swiss Attorney General is investigating collusion in vote rigging of both Qatar and Russia for the World Cup. So that's ongoing. So I think any association with Qatar with an ongoing investigation into alleged bribery of that scale is foolhardy, in my personal opinion, again not speaking on behalf of my organisation. But on the issue of the current crisis with Russia and WADA, it's quite complex as well. I think lawyers can speak more to how there will be multiple ongoing issues related to discrimination of Russian athletes, in fact, who are now being banned for having served their sentences for doping. But part of the decision of the International Olympic Committee was to ban all Russians who had a previous record, but to allow others to compete under the flag. Our general position, or at least the position of Transparency International Russia, is that the IOC should have simply modelled the decision of the International Athletics Federation, which applied a blanket ban to Russia, because their position was that, broadly speaking, that the system of state-sponsored doping in Russia, which is really fascinating. I mean, the sheer, how would you say politely?
Skill.
Yeah, the skill in which they use the Secret Service to transfer vials, to change the samples and so forth, is just staggering. But we talk a lot about why corruption in sport is important. It's about public trust. And really, we cannot say with any confidence that anybody participating in the forthcoming Olympics under the Russian flag can expect that people will trust that they're running clean. And we'll see this when the Olympics starts. Any competitor from Russia, and I feel very sorry for those who are clean, who wins a medal, is not going to be trusted. And it's a complex situation, but it also illustrates a lot of shortcomings in the World Anti-Doping Agency in itself, because these investigations should have happened years ago. I mean, the evidence was brought to them in 2010 by the same whistleblowers, who then in desperation had to go to a German investigative reporter who exposed it, sent it back to WADA, etc. So there's a whole litany of failure in this, but the last element of failure, I would say, falls at the IOC in really obfuscating on the issue and opening up the inevitability of dozens of Court of Arbitration for Sport cases, which, as you've already mentioned, are not necessarily going to result in fair outcomes.
David, before you make a comment, to the very last point that Gareth just made, what I want to ask you, as it kind of relates to this Russian doping scandal, is Is this a reflection of the international sport justice system that you were talking about earlier? And can you comment on that?
Absolutely. So I'm this weird guy right now who the Russians love, okay? You're going to see me all over RT television. In fact, they asked me to come on television right before I got here. And here's why. You have to understand that the system is so broken that the McLaren report has some real deficiencies. So I'm the weird guy arguing that we have a procedural problem. And the Russians like me because that procedural problem weighs in their favor right now. Next year, it will be the athletes that I usually deal with, which is everybody else. But we have a big procedural problem. Let me give you an example. The McLaren report is a very serious document. It should be taken very seriously. We should investigate it thoroughly. Every allegation in there should be investigated with the utmost importance. But it has a very big problem, and it goes to the heart of what we're talking about in terms of the unsophisticated nature of sport justice. And that is, not a single person in Russia has been allowed to respond. Okay? Let's put the shoes on the other foot. If Russia tomorrow were to launch an investigation and determine that the United States had a statewide doping problem, that a number of U.S. athletes they alleged had done numerous things in violations of WADA's code, the anti-doping code, and then the IOC then proceeded to initiate banning U.S. athletes, carte blanche, entirely from the system. And then we headed into Rio, and and U.S. athletes didn't know where they were coming or going. We'd be up in arms, okay? It's not about teams here. It's not about nations. It's about process. The McLaren report should have been allowed to go on and be rebutted. We didn't have that. The bizarre rationalizations by IAAF. Now, IAAF are now selling themselves as the reference body for how to handle this problem. There's only one thing that they want you to forget, that the IAAF are under investigation. The very leaders of the IAAF resigned in disgrace and are under investigation by the French police for taking kickbacks for doping violations. So this is how corrupt and rotten this world is. We have some failures of due process. What's worse is that Russian athletes are now presumed guilty, thanks to the IOC, as they go into court. We all know that that's wrong. That only violates thousands of years of common law training. But this is the problem with the process, is we have this rotten process. What's disturbing of the Russian doping crisis and the rush to judgment, and I'm not saying that the McLaren report is invalid. I'm saying it's incredibly important, but it's got to be handled right. And if we set this awful precedent, yes, today I'm telling you that I'm defending Russia because the process is rotten. But let me tell you something. I've seen this bite athletes and administrators across the world for 5 years. And next year, the terrible precedent being set will come back and haunt us. And the question is how long is it going to take to untangle this mess? And that's why the ABA has to get involved in the sport justice system.
So let me turn it quickly to Preston in this regard. So if David is correct that this reflects a lot about the nature today of the international sport justice system, what role is there in the private sector, or even as it relates to monitors, somewhat separate from the IPSIG that you discussed? What kind of options exist out there theoretically, hopefully realistically, for addressing and putting that kind of change on a compliance level to fix some of these problems?
So I think back to a discussion that we had actually in preparation for this panel now. You go to your basics, right? So you have the FIFA that is now trying to augment its auditing and compliance committee and trying to make sure that it's buttoned up and is meeting best standards. Thinking about the Russian example, as the public, and to Gareth's point, we are skeptical, right? We are skeptical of Russian athletes. The Russian Olympic program, in a lot of ways, has been cheapened. I talk about that issue. You don't, in order for people to watch the sport, You cannot allow the image of the sport to be cheapened. So what compliance features are there? You certainly have to have your audit and compliance committee that's strong, but you need to have a chief compliance officer in the sports program that's at issue, with hopefully who was reporting independently to either an outsider or to the government, or someone who's got some real oversight. But it's difficult, right? And I think that I think Dave's point about making sure that the report can be rebutted is important too. Frankly, it's a learning device for other sports organizations. They'll give their side, and you obviously have the regulator side as well. And through that process, your compliance committee, your chief of compliance, can be educated and understand how to do the training and make sure that internally they're meeting best practices.
So I want to turn our attention just slightly to another issue as it relates to what we're talking about. So we talk about Russian doping on the one, allegations of Russian doping on the one hand, and these kinds of scandals. I want to turn it to Mike Pugh again. You know, we've addressed it so far, I think, almost the entirety of this panel from the perspective of the problems as they are manifested. Well, and we've talked a little bit, as Preston was just talking about now, about how some of these things can be fixed after the fact. How does this affect, all of these issues affect us when we talk about the perspective of the bid organizations, the bid cities, when they're putting these things together? What kind of changes need to happen or already have happened that contribute to hopefully putting together bids that are clean, whether it relates to a soccer tournament or the Olympics or any other kind of international set of games?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And one of the things that, I'm focused on too, having represented bidding countries and cities and hosting, is that all of this corruption makes the process of representing a bidder much more challenging. When we go out and say we would like to bring the World Cup to the United States, by way of example, you have to go to cities then and say, would you be interested in hosting? And on a clean slate, most of them would love to host. But with all of this scandal in the background, it becomes very challenging for a mayor or for a city council to say, yeah, we'd love to open up our city to a bunch of thieves to come in and victimize us. And so this presents a lot of problems in the hosting arena. I do think that there are certain, I'm not sure this exactly answers the question, I think there are a number of changes that one can make to the process, though, that would hopefully yield less trouble. One is, for example, the bidding model, I think, is broken. So as it works now, if you want to host the Olympic Games or the World Cup, you're pretty much excluded if you belong to the Confederation. So that's, in short, the European Confederation or the South American Confederation or the North American Confederation, et cetera. If you belong to the Confederation that hosted the last time, you can't bid for the next time. So it can't go to France and then Germany. But other than that, it's pretty much wide open. Similarly, the Olympics, it's pretty much wide open. And one thing I would suggest is that by making it wide open, you end up having a lot of disappointed suitors, and you have no criteria by which you're being held, no standards by which you're being held, no guidelines. I think that damages the organizations. I think they would have much better results if these organizations, first of all, made it very clear what standards they were judging by. And again, and this is near and dear to my heart, when the U.S. bid to host the 2022 World Cup, McKinsey issued a report to FIFA that said the United States would be the most successful, financially successful host for 2022. FIFA's own internal report said technically the U.S. was most sound. And those were the two reports that were issued, technical and financial, and yet the U.S. didn't win. If there were clear standards, think about the RFP process you have probably in your own cities or in your own states when they go out to bid. It's very clear how they're going to be scored. FIFA and IOC have not had that, and I think that it's very damaging, and I think cities and potential host nations, bidding nations, should require that. I think that FIFA and IOC would be well served to start to institute that. I think the final comment I would make then is that as they go through this process and they're costing cities and countries tremendous amounts of money, and they fail, and right now the Los Angeles bid is the third U.S. bid to host the Olympic Games, and Paris is bidding now for the fourth time. I think it's going to be very damaging to the IOC if, look, either Paris or LA will lose, and possibly they both will lose. And I think it's going to be very tough if you're in France to justify a fifth bid to the IOC, and I think it's going to be very tough in the United States to justify a fourth bid when you've lost so many times, and I think that ends up harming the organizations. And so I think that's another reason that there needs to be a clear reform of the bidding process.
Sure, I think Gareth has a comment. We're right at that point where the session, unfortunately, is almost over, but...
Very quick response, just that on the issue of pre-bid criteria, we are working with the bidding committees in each of the cities that are running to host the 2024 Olympics. But one of our recommendations is that there should be city referenda. It should be put to the people whether they want the thing. And in all cities that have done that so far, Munich, Hamburg, I think Stockholm, and in Boston, I don't think there was a referendum, but there was at least a public debate. In all the cases where people are asked, do you want this? And they look at the figures, they say no. And I think the real crisis for the Olympics is actually not around governance going forward. It's the fact that the only cities that are going to want it, that are going to bid for it, post-2024, is Azerbaijan and equivalents. And that's going to further diminish the credibility of the Olympics as a competition.
Thank you, Dave.
The thing you have to understand is that democracies across the world are waking up to the simple reality that mega events nationalize costs and privatize profits. And democracy after democracy after democracy, it's incredibly easier to make the case that it's a bad deal. And that's why you're going to see all these mega events continue to move towards autocratic regimes.
I just wanted to jump in one footnote, and I'm sure we can debate this. In the United States, since 1984, the Olympics have always made money for the host city.